Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the beautiful chaos that was Isaac Newton discovering gravity. The brilliant, antisocial genius who revolutionized physics while being absolutely impossible to have dinner with. So before we get started, hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy watching me turn historical geniuses into relatable disasters. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always wild to see who's up at 3 a.m. contemplating apples with me. Now grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and let's talk about how a 22-year-old with serious social issues and an unhealthy obsession with falling fruit managed to crack the code of the universe. So, you think you could have discovered universal gravitation while stuck at home during a plague? Adorable. Really? Like thinking you could reinvent mathematics because you got bored during quarantine. Before Isaac Newton could even dream of revolutionizing physics, he had to survive being Isaac Newton. Picture this: England, 1665, and the bubonic plague is making its grand tour like the world's worst travelling circus. Universities are shutting down faster than you can say, Black Death. And young Isaac finds himself booted back to his mother's farm in Woolsthorpe. Not exactly the gap year he'd planned. Our hero wasn't your typical farm boy. While his neighbours were concerned with important matters like, will the crops grow? And, are we all going to die horribly? Isaac was pondering why things fell down instead of, say, sideways, or in a pleasant spiral pattern. Most people took gravity for granted the same way they took breathing for granted. It just happened, and questioning it seemed about as useful as asking why water was wet. But Isaac Newton wasn't most people. He was the kind of person who would stare at a candle flame for 3 hours straight, not because he was mesmerized, but because he was trying to figure out exactly what fire was made of. His mother, Hannah, probably wished he'd shown half as much interest in actual farming. Isaac, she'd say, the sheep need feeding. And Isaac would respond with something like, but mother, have you noticed how the sheep always walk downward on hills, never upward without effort? Fascinating. Hannah would sigh the sigh of a woman who'd given birth to a future genius, but currently had to live with a 22-year-old who treated every falling object like a personal affront to the natural order. The year was 1666, what historians would later call his annus mirabilis, which sounds like a magical incantation but actually just means miracle year in Latin. Because apparently, when you're a genius stuck at home during a pandemic, you don't binge, watch anything or learn to bake bread like a normal person. You revolutionize mathematics, optics, and physics. Show off. Newton had already been making waves at Cambridge, and by waves, I mean the kind that made his professors either deeply impressed or deeply concerned. He'd arrive at lectures with notebooks full of ideas that hadn't been invented yet, asking questions like, but what if light isn't actually white? His classmates were trying to memorize Aristotle, and Newton was over there basically rewriting the universe in his spare time. Let's pause here to consider what Cambridge was like in the 1660s. Imagine a university where the cutting-edge curriculum still revolved around ancient Greek philosophy, where professors taught that heavy objects fell faster than light ones, because Aristotle said so, and where questioning established wisdom was considered somewhere between impolite and heretical. Into this intellectual environment walked Isaac Newton, armed with a mind that treated received wisdom the way a woodchipper treats tree branches. Newton's professors probably went home at night wondering if they were dealing with the next great genius, or if they should quietly suggest that Isaac pursue a nice, safe career in sheep farming. His questions weren't just challenging, they were the kind that made you realize you'd never actually thought about basic assumptions. Why did everyone accept that celestial objects moved in perfect circles? Had anyone actually proven that the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, were actually fundamental? What if mathematics could describe natural phenomena with precision rather than just approximation? These weren't the kind of questions that made you popular at faculty dinners. Now, trapped in Woolsthorpe with nothing but time, sheep, and his increasingly bewildered mother, Newton began to notice things. Not normal things like, the weather is nice, or I should probably help with the harvest. No, he noticed that everything, absolutely everything, fell toward the earth. Rocks, leaves. His breakfast when he inevitably got distracted and dropped it while contemplating the mathematical properties of porridge. The famous apple story. It's probably true. Though knowing Newton, he likely spent the next 6 hours after it fell calculating the exact trajectory, speed, and wondering why the apple fell straight down instead of at an angle. Most people would think, gravity, and move on with their lives. Newton thought. But what is gravity? Where does it come from? And why does it work the same way on apples and planets? Yes, planets. Because Newton wasn't content to limit his gravitational musings to fruit. He'd lie on his back in the fields, staring up at the moon, and instead of composing poetry or having normal human thoughts, he'd wonder. If everything falls toward Earth, what keeps the moon from falling? And if it is falling, why doesn't it ever hit us? This was the kind of thinking that made Newton simultaneously brilliant and absolutely impossible to have a normal conversation with. Imagine trying to discuss the weather with someone who responds with, "Interesting you mention clouds. Have you considered that they're essentially floating water, defying the very gravitational force that should pull them earthward? Unless, of course, they're in a constant state of falling and rising simultaneously due to air currents and thermal dynamics." His poor mother probably started avoiding him at mealtimes. Hannah Newton was a practical woman who had raised her son largely alone after his father died before Isaac's birth. She'd remarried when Isaac was 3, sending him to live with his maternal grandmother while she started a new family. This early abandonment probably contributed to Newton's lifelong difficulty with human relationships, his need for absolute intellectual control, and his tendency to treat emotional connections as mathematical problems to be solved rather than experiences to be enjoyed. When Isaac returned to Woolsthorpe during the plague years, Hannah was dealing with a young man who had clearly inherited his late father's intellect, but had amplified it to almost supernatural levels. Isaac Sr. had been a farmer, but he'd also been literate and numerically sophisticated, rare qualities in 17th century rural England. Isaac Jr. had taken these traits and weaponized them against the natural world. Hannah would watch her son spend entire afternoons staring at water flowing in streams, not because he enjoyed nature, but because he was trying to understand fluid dynamics. She'd see him drop objects from increasingly elaborate heights, not out of boredom, but because he was conducting experiments to measure acceleration. Normal mothers worried about their sons getting into trouble with girls or drinking too much alcohol. Hannah worried that her son might accidentally discover something so profound it would change the world and make him even more impossible to live with. But Newton was onto something massive, literally. He began to suspect that the same force pulling apples off trees was also pulling the moon toward Earth. The moon, he reasoned, was constantly falling toward Earth, but moving sideways fast enough that it kept missing. Like the world's most successful example of clumsiness turned into orbital mechanics. This insight required Newton to fundamentally reimagine how motion worked. Since ancient times, people had assumed that objects naturally came to rest. That motion required constant force to maintain. If you stopped pushing a cart, it stopped moving. If you threw a stone, it eventually fell to the ground. Motion seemed temporary, rest seemed permanent. Newton realized this was completely backward. Objects in motion, he suspected, naturally stayed in motion unless something interfered with them. The cart stopped because of friction, not because motion was unnatural. The stone fell because gravity pulled it down, not because it wanted to rest. In the vacuum of space, objects would move forever unless acted upon by external forces. This was revolutionary thinking. Before Newton, people believed the heavens operated by completely different rules than Earth. Celestial objects were perfect, unchanging, governed by divine mathematics. Earthly objects were messy, corrupted, temporary. Newton was suggesting the same physical laws applied everywhere, from falling fruit to orbiting planets to distant stars. The implications were staggering. If Newton was right, the universe wasn't divided into separate realms with different rules. There was one set of physical laws governing everything from the smallest pebble to the largest star. The cosmos was unified, comprehensible, and potentially predictable. He spent months working out the mathematical relationship. If his theory was correct, the force should decrease with the square of the distance. Double the distance, quarter the force. It was elegant, simple, and completely unproven. Newton needed data, but this was the 17th century. There were no satellites, no precise measurements of planetary distances, no smartphones to Google, how far is the moon? He had to work with whatever rough estimates existed, most of which had been calculated by ancient astronomers using methods that were equal parts brilliant, and hope this works out. The available astronomical data came from centuries of careful observation. But careful, by 17th century standards, meant something very different than modern precision. Tycho Brahe, the great Danish astronomer, had spent decades making the most accurate measurements possible with the naked eye and primitive instruments. His data was extraordinarily good for its time, but still rough by Newton's standards. Newton had access to estimates of the moon's distance, about 60 Earth radii, the moon's orbital period, about 28 days, and an Earth's radius L about 4,000 miles. These numbers were approximate, but they were the best available. Using them, Newton could test whether his inverse square law actually described the moon's motion. The story goes that Newton's first calculations didn't match his predictions. The numbers were close but not exact, which for Newton was basically failure. He was the kind of perfectionist who would redo an entire proof if he didn't like the way he'd written a particular number. Close wasn't good enough. The universe either operated according to mathematical laws or it didn't, and if his calculations were wrong, either his theory was flawed or his data was bad. Being Newton, he assumed the data was bad and kept working. But let's talk about what Newton was actually calculating, because the mathematics involved was extraordinarily sophisticated for its time. He was trying to prove that if the moon was held in orbit by the same force that made apples fall, then that force must decrease with the square of the distance from Earth's center. For objects near Earth's surface, acceleration due to gravity was approximately 32 feet per second squared. For the moon, orbiting at roughly 60 Earth radii, the gravitational acceleration should be 1 ton 3/600th as strong, since 60 squared equals 3/600. This weaker gravity would provide exactly the centripetal force needed to keep the moon in its circular orbit. The calculation required Newton to treat the Earth as if all its mass were concentrated at a single point, its center. This wasn't obviously true. Why should a distributed mass act gravitationally as if it were all located at one spot? Newton would later prove this mathematically, but during his plague years, he simply assumed it and hoped he was right. He also had to assume the moon's orbit was circular, which it isn't quite. The moon's orbit is slightly elliptical, which complicates the mathematics considerably. Newton was making approximations on top of approximations, using imperfect data to test a theory that required precision he couldn't achieve. Despite these challenges, Newton's initial calculations came remarkably close to working. The numbers weren't perfect, but they were close enough to suggest he was onto something profound. The same force that governed falling apples might indeed control the moon's orbit. Years passed. Newton returned to Cambridge when the plague finally decided it had terrorized England sufficiently. He buried himself in his studies, continuing to refine his gravitational theory while simultaneously revolutionizing optics and mathematics. His professors had learned to just nod and smile when Newton explained his latest discoveries. The way you'd react if your student casually mentioned they'd figured out how to turn lead into gold over the weekend. Cambridge in the late 1660s was slowly adapting to Newton's presence. Initially, his professors had tried to channel his curiosity into acceptable directions: study Aristotle, memorize Euclid, learn the approved curriculum. But Newton had a way of transforming any assignment into an investigation of fundamental principles. Asked to study geometric optics, Newton built his own telescopes and discovered that white light was actually a mixture of all colors. Asked to review ancient astronomy, Newton began developing a new mathematical framework for analyzing planetary motion. Asked to examine philosophical arguments about the nature of matter, Newton started experiments in alchemy that would consume decades of his later life. His fellow students found Newton simultaneously impressive and intimidating. He could solve mathematical problems that baffled everyone else, but he seemed completely uninterested in normal social interactions. While other students discussed politics, gossip, or future careers, Newton would hold forth on topics like the mathematical properties of curves or the optical behavior of prisms. Newton's professors began to realize they were dealing with someone genuinely exceptional. Dr. Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor of mathematics, recognized Newton's extraordinary abilities and began mentoring him. Barrow was himself a brilliant mathematician, but he had the wisdom to recognize that Newton's talent exceeded his own. When Barrow resigned his professorship in 1669, he recommended that Newton, barely 26 years old, be appointed his successor. This appointment was controversial. Newton was young, socially awkward, and his ideas were often incomprehensible to his colleagues. But his mathematical abilities were undeniable, and Cambridge desperately needed someone who could advance their scientific reputation. Newton became the Lucasian professor of mathematics, the same position Stephen Hawking would hold centuries later. As a professor, Newton was notoriously ineffective at traditional teaching. His lectures were sparsely attended because students couldn't understand what he was talking about. Newton would arrive, deliver complex mathematical proofs to nearly empty rooms, and leave without seeming to notice or care about the lack of audience engagement. But Newton wasn't really interested in teaching undergraduates basic mathematics. He was pursuing investigations that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge. His gravitational theory remained his private obsession. He'd share bits and pieces with colleagues, usually in the form of incomprehensible mathematical proofs that left them more confused than enlightened. Robert Hooke, another brilliant scientist and Newton's future nemesis, claimed he'd had similar ideas about inverse square forces. This led to the kind of academic drama that makes modern Twitter feuds look civilized. Hooke was a genuine polymath, architect, inventor, microscopist, and physicist, but he had the misfortune of crossing paths with Newton during Newton's most productive and most paranoid period. The Newton-Hooke feud began over optics. Newton had presented his theory of colours to the Royal Society, demonstrating that white light could be separated into component colours using prisms. Hooke criticised Newton's interpretation, suggesting alternative explanations for the phenomena Newton described. Newton took this criticism as a personal attack and responded with characteristic venom. Hooke publicly suggested that Newton had stolen his ideas about inverse square gravitational forces. Newton, who possessed all the diplomatic skills of an angry hedgehog, responded by basically removing every reference to Hooke from his future publications. When Newton held a grudge, he held it with the same mathematical precision he applied to physics. The feud escalated over years. Hooke would make public claims about his priority in various discoveries. Newton would respond with detailed, mathematically sophisticated rebuttals that demonstrated not just his own superiority, but Hooke's relative incompetence. Newton had a gift for making intellectual disagreements personal, and for turning personal disagreements into lifelong vendettas. But the real breakthrough came when Newton finally got better data about the Moon's distance from Earth. New measurements revealed that his original calculations had been based on incorrect numbers. When he plugged in the corrected values, his equations worked perfectly. The same force that dropped apples indeed governed the Moon's orbit. The improved data came from several sources. French astronomers had made more precise measurements of Earth's size by surveying distances between cities at different latitudes. Better observations of lunar eclipses had refined estimates of the Moon's distance. Telescopic observations had improved measurements of planetary positions and orbital periods. When Newton recalculated using this improved data, the agreement between theory and observation was remarkable. The mathematical relationship he'd hypothesized, that gravitational force decreased with the square of distance, predicted the Moon's orbital behavior with extraordinary accuracy. Newton must have felt like he'd just solved the universe's biggest riddle. Here was the hidden mechanism behind everything: why things fell, why planets orbited, why the cosmos held together instead of flying apart into chaos. He called it universal gravitation, and it was exactly that: universal. Every particle of matter in existence was constantly attracting every other particle. But Newton, being Newton, he couldn't simply celebrate this triumph. Instead, he began to worry about implications and complications. If every particle attracted every other particle, why didn't all matter in the universe collapse into a single massive object? How could planetary orbits remain stable if every planet was constantly tugging on every other planet? What about the fixed stars? Were they really fixed? Or were they slowly moving under mutual gravitational attraction? These questions led Newton deeper into mathematical complexity. Analyzing the motion of two objects under mutual gravitational attraction was difficult but manageable. Analyzing three or more objects, the famous body problem, was mathematically nightmarish. Newton developed sophisticated approximation techniques, but exact solutions remained elusive. The implications were staggering. If Newton was right, he could predict the behavior of any object anywhere in the universe, from pebbles to planets, using the same mathematical principles. The clockwork universe wasn't just a metaphor, it was literally mechanical, governed by precise laws that could be calculated and predicted. Newton kept his discovery largely to himself for years, tinkering with the mathematics, refining, and probably driving his colleagues insane with cryptic hints about certain forces and universal principles. He was like that friend who clearly knows a secret but won't tell you what it is. Except the secret happened to be the fundamental operating system of reality. The scientific community knew Newton was working on something big. His reputation had grown from that weird kid who asks too many questions to terrifying genius who understands things the rest of us can't even pronounce. When Newton spoke at the Royal Society, people listened not because they understood him, but because they'd learned that dismissing Newton's ideas usually meant looking foolish 6 months later, when someone else confirmed he'd been right all along. Newton's reluctance to publish wasn't entirely due to perfectionism. He was also genuinely worried about the reception his ideas would receive. Universal gravitation implied that matter could somehow act across empty space without any intervening medium, what critics would call action at a distance. This seemed to violate basic principles of mechanical philosophy, which insisted that all interactions required direct contact or some kind of intervening substance. How could the sun influence Earth's motion across 93 million miles of apparently empty space? How could two objects know about each other's existence and respond accordingly? Newton's mathematical description worked perfectly, but the underlying mechanism remained mysterious and philosophically troubling. Newton also worried about religious implications. If the universe operated according to mechanical laws, what role did divine providence play in natural phenomena? Were miracles possible in a mathematically determined cosmos? Would his discoveries be seen as supporting or undermining religious faith? These concerns were not trivial in 17th century England. The Royal Society operated under royal patronage, and its members had to be careful not to advance ideas that might be seen as politically or religiously subversive. Newton was already suspect due to his unorthodox religious views. He was secretly an Arian, believing that Christ was subordinate to God the Father, a position that would have been considered heretical by mainstream Christianity. Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, and Edmund Halley, yes, the comic guy, were discussing the problem of planetary motion over coffee one day, as scientists do. They'd all suspected that some kind of inverse square law governed planetary orbits, but none of them could prove it mathematically. The mathematics involved were beyond their capabilities, requiring techniques that Newton had developed, but not yet shared publicly. Halley, either braver or more foolish than his colleagues, decided to ask Newton directly. He visited Cambridge and posed the question: if a planet were attracted to the sun by a force that decreased with the square of distance, what would be the shape of its orbit? Newton's response was characteristically understated. Oh, that. I worked that out years ago. It would be an ellipse. When Halley asked to see the proof, Newton casually mentioned that he'd misplaced his calculations, but could probably redo them if Halley was interested. This is like someone asking you for directions and you responding with, "I drew you a map, but I lost it. I could probably rebuild the entire city from memory if you want." The Halley immediately recognized the significance of what Newton was claiming. Kepler had discovered empirically that planetary orbits were elliptical, but no one had been able to explain why. If Newton could derive elliptical orbits from first principles using an inverse square force law, it would be one of the greatest theoretical triumphs in the history of science. Newton disappeared for months, supposedly, redoing his calculations. What he actually did was write the Principia Mathematica, which is basically the user manual for the universe. In it, he laid out his 3 laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation with mathematical proofs so elegant and complete that they would dominate physics for the next 200 years. The process of writing the Principia was extraordinary even by Newton's standards. He worked with obsessive intensity, often forgetting to eat or sleep. His secretary reported finding Newton at his desk in the morning, wearing the same clothes from the previous day, surrounded by papers covered with calculations. Newton would work for days on a single mathematical proof, revising and refining until every step was logically perfect. The mathematical techniques Newton employed were revolutionary. He had to invent new methods for handling infinitesimal quantities, what would later be called calculus. He developed geometric approaches that could analyze curves, areas, and rates of change with unprecedented precision. Many of his mathematical innovations were so advanced that they wouldn't be fully understood by other mathematicians for decades. The first law: objects in motion stay in motion, objects at rest stay at rest, unless something pushes them around. Simple enough. Though it overturned centuries of Aristotelian physics that claimed moving objects naturally slowed down and stopped. This first law seemed almost trivial, but its implications were profound. It meant that motion was the natural state of objects, not rest. In a universe without friction, without air resistance, without any interfering forces, objects would move forever in straight lines at constant speeds. Rest was just a special case of motion, motion with zero velocity. The law also implied that force was needed not to maintain motion, but to change motion. This was completely contrary to everyday experience, where constant effort seemed required to keep things moving. Newton realized that everyday experience was misleading because we live in a world full of friction, and air resistance, and other dissipative forces that constantly slow moving objects. In space, where these interfering forces are absent, Newton's first law becomes obviously true. Spacecraft coast for months or years without expending fuel, moving at constant velocity until they encounter gravitational fields or fire their engines. The law that seemed counterintuitive on Earth revealed itself as fundamental to understanding motion throughout the universe. The second law: force equals mass times acceleration, or FMA. This gave scientists their first precise way to calculate forces, predict motion, and generally boss physics around with mathematics. This law was perhaps Newton's most practically useful contribution. It provided a mathematical relationship between observable quantities, force, mass, and acceleration that could be measured and manipulated. Engineers could use FMA to design machines, predict structural loads, and calculate the performance of mechanical systems. The law also clarified the concept of mass. Before Newton, the distinction between weight and mass was unclear. Newton showed that mass was an intrinsic property of objects, their resistance to acceleration, while weight was simply the force exerted on mass by gravity. An object's mass remained constant whether it was on Earth, on the Moon, or in deep space, but its weight changed depending on local gravitational conditions. FMA also revealed why heavy and light objects fall at the same rate in a vacuum. Heavier objects experience more gravitational force, but they also have more mass to accelerate. The greater force and greater mass cancel out exactly, resulting in identical acceleration for all objects regardless of their weight. The third law: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Walk forward. Push the Earth backward. The Earth doesn't noticeably move because it's significantly more massive than you, but technically, you're both pushing each other around. This law had immediate practical applications. It explained how rockets could work in space. By ejecting mass in one direction, they experienced a force in the opposite direction. It clarified how walking, swimming, and flying worked. All required pushing against something to generate forward motion. But the third law also had subtle implications that wouldn't be fully appreciated for centuries. It implied that forces always came in pairs, that isolated forces couldn't exist in nature. It suggested that the universe was somehow balanced, that every push was matched by an equal and opposite push. The law also hinted at conservation principles that would become central to later physics. If forces always came in equal and opposite pairs, then the total momentum of isolated systems should remain constant. This conservation of momentum would prove to be one of the most fundamental principles in physics. And then the big one: universal gravitation. Every object in the universe attracts every other object with a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. F1 mu in theory. Simple, elegant, and capable of explaining everything from falling apples to the orbit of comets. This law was Newton's masterpiece. It unified terrestrial and celestial physics, showing that the same force governing everyday falling objects also controlled the motion of planets, moons, and stars. The mathematical relationship was precise enough to make detailed predictions about planetary positions, comet trajectories, and tidal patterns. The law also revealed something profound about the structure of space and matter. Every particle of matter in the universe was constantly interacting with every other particle, no matter how distant. The gravitational influence of distant stars was negligible but real. The universe was interconnected in ways that had never been imagined. Newton had essentially discovered that the universe was a giant, incredibly complex machine, but a machine nonetheless, governed by mathematical laws that could be understood and predicted. There was no magic, no divine intervention required for daily operations, just mathematics, working the same way everywhere all the time. The Principia was published in 1687, and it changed everything. Suddenly, scientists could predict eclipses, calculate planetary positions centuries in advance, and explain tides. Newton had given humanity its first glimpse of the universe as a comprehensible, predictable system rather than a series of mysterious divine interventions. The publication process itself was dramatic. The Royal Society was supposed to publish the work, but they were financially strapped after losing money on a previous book about fish. Edmund Halley, recognizing the importance of Newton's work, paid for the publication out of his own pocket. Without Halley's personal investment, the Principia might have remained unpublished for years. The initial reception was mixed. Many readers found the mathematical content incomprehensible. The geometric style Newton employed was deliberately archaic. He could have used his new calculus techniques to make the proofs more accessible, but he chose classical geometric methods that only the most sophisticated mathematicians could follow. This wasn't accidental. Newton was presenting his most profound insights, and he wanted to make sure only serious scholars could understand them. The Principia was written for an audience of perhaps a dozen people in all of Europe who had the mathematical sophistication to follow Newton's arguments. Everyone else would have to take the conclusions on faith or wait for simpler explanations to be developed. Continental European mathematicians, led by Gottfried Leibniz, initially resisted Newton's gravitational theory. They objected to action at a distance, on philosophical grounds, preferring mechanical explanations that involved direct contact between objects or interactions through intervening media. How could massive objects influence each other across empty space without some kind of connecting mechanism? French scientists, in particular, remained skeptical for decades. They preferred Cartesian physics, which explained planetary motion through vortices in a space filling fluid. This mechanical approach seemed more philosophically acceptable than Newton's mysterious gravitational attraction, even though it couldn't make accurate quantitative predictions. The controversy gradually resolved as Newton's predictions proved superior to alternatives. When Halley used Newton's methods to predict the return of his eponymous comet in 1758, and the comet appeared exactly when and where Newton's calculations indicated it would, even skeptics had to acknowledge the power of gravitational theory. But here's the thing about Newton: he was never satisfied. Even after revolutionizing physics, he kept asking deeper questions. He knew that gravity worked, but he had no idea what it actually was. His famous quote, "I frame no hypotheses," wasn't modesty, it was frustration. He could describe gravity's effects perfectly, but couldn't explain its mechanism. How did objects separated by vast distances of empty space somehow know to attract each other? This bothered Newton tremendously. He'd solved the what and how of gravity, but not the why. It was like figuring out that pushing buttons on a remote control changed TV channels without understanding electricity, radio waves, or electronics. The system worked, but the underlying mechanism remained mysterious. Newton spent considerable time speculating about gravitational mechanisms. Maybe space was filled with some kind of subtle fluid that transmitted gravitational influences. Maybe particles were constantly being exchanged between massive objects, creating apparent attraction through momentum transfer. Maybe gravity operated through some kind of spiritual or non-material principle that transcended ordinary mechanical causation. None of these speculations led anywhere productive. Newton eventually concluded that understanding gravitational mechanism was beyond the capabilities of 17th century natural philosophy. His job was to describe mathematical relationships between observable phenomena, not to explain ultimate causes. I frame no hypothesis became his methodological principle, focus on what can be measured and calculated, not on underlying mechanisms that might be fundamentally unknowable. This methodological shift was revolutionary. Before Newton, natural philosophers expected to explain phenomena by identifying underlying causes. Why did objects fall? Because they sought their natural place in the cosmic hierarchy. Why did planets move? Because they were carried by crystalline spheres or pushed by angelic intelligences. Newton abandoned this quest for ultimate causes and focused instead on mathematical relationships. Why did objects fall? Because they accelerated toward Earth at 30 feet per second squared. Why did planets move? Because they were attracted to the Sun by a force proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance. These weren't ultimate explanations, but they were extraordinarily useful descriptions. They allowed precise predictions and practical applications without requiring complete understanding of underlying mechanisms. Newton had discovered that you could do science without knowing everything, that mathematical relationships were valuable even when fundamental causes remained mysterious. Newton spent his later years pursuing alchemy, trying to understand the fundamental nature of matter and force. His gravitational theory had revealed that the universe operated like clockwork, but he wanted to understand who had built the clock and what it was made of. These investigations led nowhere scientifically, but they reveal something important about Newton's character. He wasn't content with practical success. He wanted to understand reality at its deepest level. Newton's alchemical investigations consumed decades and produced thousands of pages of notes. He studied ancient texts, conducted elaborate experiments, and developed complex theories about the transmutation of metals and the fundamental structure of matter. From a modern perspective, these efforts seem like a waste of Newton's extraordinary talents. But Newton saw alchemy and physics as parts of a unified quest to understand the deepest principles of nature. Alchemy in Newton's time wasn't simply primitive chemistry. It was a sophisticated philosophical and experimental tradition that sought to understand the relationships between matter, force, and spirit. Alchemists believed that understanding these relationships would reveal fundamental truths about the structure of reality and humanity's place in the cosmic order. Newton approached alchemy with the same mathematical rigor he applied to physics. He developed quantitative theories about chemical reactions, precise techniques for purifying substances, and elaborate experimental procedures for testing alchemical hypotheses. His laboratory was filled with furnaces, retorts, and chemical apparatus that he used for investigations that might last months or years. The connection between Newton's physics and his alchemy was deeper than it might initially appear. Both sought to identify universal principles that could explain diverse natural phenomena. Gravitational theory showed that a single mathematical law could account for terrestrial and celestial motion. Alchemical theory promised that a small number of fundamental processes could explain the bewildering variety of chemical and biological phenomena. Newton believed that the same forces responsible for gravitational attraction might also operate at microscopic scales, determining how particles of matter combine to form different substances. He speculated that chemical reactions involved attractions and repulsions between particles, governed by mathematical laws similar to those controlling planetary motion. These speculations led nowhere during Newton's lifetime, but they anticipated later developments in chemistry and atomic physics. The idea that matter consisted of particles interacting through forces would eventually become central to modern science. Newton's alchemical investigations, while scientifically unproductive, revealed his intuition that the universe was unified by a small number of fundamental principles operating at all scales. The impact of Newton's discovery rippled through every aspect of human knowledge. Philosophers had to grapple with a universe that operated by mathematical laws rather than divine whim. Religious thinkers debated whether Newton had revealed God's design or eliminated the need for divine intervention. Scientists found themselves with unprecedented power to predict and control natural phenomena. The philosophical implications were profound and troubling. If the universe operated according to deterministic mathematical laws, what happened to human free will? If every event was the inevitable result of prior causes operating according to fixed principles, were human choices real or illusory? Pierre-Simon Laplace, a later French mathematician, articulated this concern most clearly. If an intelligence could know the exact position and momentum of every particle in the universe, Laplace argued it could predict the entire future and retrodict the entire past. Past, present, and future would be equally determined by the mathematical laws governing particle interactions. This Laplacian demon thought experiment revealed the disturbing implications of Newton's success. Universal gravitation suggested that the cosmos was completely deterministic, that everything from planetary orbits to human thoughts was the inevitable result of particles following mathematical laws. Freedom, creativity, and moral responsibility seemed to become impossible in such a universe. Religious thinkers responded to Newtonian mechanics in various ways. Some saw Newton's laws as revealing the mathematical perfection of divine creation. God was the supreme geometer who had designed a cosmos operating according to elegant mathematical principles. Newton himself believed that his discoveries revealed divine wisdom and power. Others worried that Newtonian mechanics eliminated God from day-to-day natural operations. If the universe ran itself according to mathematical laws, when did God intervene? Miracles became problematic in a world governed by universal physical principles. Prayer seemed pointless if everything was predetermined by particle interactions. Deists found in Newton support for their belief in a distant, non-intervening God who had created the universe as a self-operating machine. God was the divine clockmaker who had wound up the cosmic mechanism and then stepped back to let it run according to its internal principles. This view preserved God's role as creator while eliminating the need for constant divine oversight. Navigation improved dramatically when sailors could calculate their position using Newton's laws. Before Newton, navigation relied on dead reckoning, celestial observations, and rough estimates that led to frequent shipwrecks and navigational disasters. Newtonian mechanics made possible precise calculation of planetary and lunar positions, enabling navigators to determine longitude and latitude with unprecedented accuracy. The British government was so impressed by the practical benefits of Newtonian navigation that they established the Board of Longitude, offering enormous prizes for improved methods of determining position at sea. John Harrison's marine chronometer, which allowed accurate timekeeping aboard ships, solved the longitude problem by enabling navigators to compare local time with Greenwich time and calculate their east-west position. Engineering became possible on scales previously unimaginable when builders could precisely predict how structures would behave under various forces. Before Newton, architectural and engineering design relied heavily on experience, rules of thumb, and trial and error methods that led to frequent structural failures. Newtonian mechanics provided the mathematical foundation for calculating loads, stresses, and structural stability. Bridge builders could now calculate the forces acting on different structural elements and design bridges that wouldn't collapse under expected loads. Architects could design buildings that would withstand wind, earthquakes, and the weight of their own materials. Military engineers could calculate the trajectories of artillery projectiles and design fortifications that could withstand bombardment. The Industrial Revolution might not have been possible without the mathematical foundation Newton provided for understanding mechanics and forces. Steam engines, textile machinery, and manufacturing equipment all required precise understanding of force, motion, and energy transfer, concepts that Newton's laws made calculable and predictable. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine relied heavily on Newtonian principles. Understanding the relationship between pressure, force, and mechanical work allowed engineers to optimize engine design for maximum efficiency. The governors that regulated steam engine speed operated according to principles of rotational dynamics that Newton had first mathematically described. Textile mills used systems of pulleys, gears, and mechanical linkages that would have been impossible to design without Newton's laws of motion. Mill owners could calculate the forces transmitted through complex machinery and predict how much power would be needed to operate looms, spinning wheels, and other equipment. But perhaps most importantly, Newton demonstrated that the universe was comprehensible. Before the Principia, natural philosophy was largely descriptive. Scholars observed phenomena and categorized them, but rarely expected to find underlying mathematical principles that could predict future behavior. Newton showed that reality itself was mathematical, that the language of God was algebra and geometry. This was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. If the universe operated like a machine, then theoretically, everything could be predicted and controlled. Human behavior, the weather, the fate of civilizations, all of it might be reducible to mathematical equations. The clockwork universe implied determinism on a scale that made free will seem like an illusion. Newton himself seemed oddly detached from these philosophical implications. He discovered the operating system of reality, but he remained focused on technical problems, improving his calculations, refining his proofs, and pursuing increasingly obscure investigations into optics, alchemy, and biblical chronology. His personality remained as difficult as ever. He was notoriously sensitive to criticism, prone to bitter feuds, and capable of holding grudges for decades. When Leibniz claimed to have invented calculus independently, Newton orchestrated a campaign to destroy his rival's reputation that lasted years and involved forged documents, anonymous pamphlets, and academic character assassination. The calculus controversy consumed much of Newton's later career and revealed the darker aspects of his personality. Newton and Leibniz had indeed developed calculus independently, using different notation and approaching the subject from different philosophical perspectives. Leibniz published first, but Newton had developed his methods earlier. A reasonable resolution would have acknowledged both men's contributions. Instead, Newton treated the dispute as a zero-sum competition where only one inventor could be recognized. He used his position as president of the Royal Society to orchestrate what amounted to an academic witch hunt. He appointed committees to investigate the priority question, then secretly wrote their reports himself. He published anonymous attacks on Leibniz, while publicly claiming to remain above the controversy. Newton's behavior during the calculus controversy was petty, vindictive, and scientifically counterproductive. It delayed the adoption of superior Leibnizian notation in Britain, handicapping British mathematics for generations. It created bitter divisions between British and continental European scientists that lasted long after both Newton and Leibniz were dead. The feud revealed that Newton, for all his intellectual brilliance, was emotionally immature and pathologically sensitive to perceived slights. He interpreted disagreement as personal attack and responded to criticism with scorched earth retaliation. His genius coexisted with personality flaws that made him extraordinarily difficult to work with. Yet Newton's gravitational theory stood above these personal defects. The mathematics worked regardless of Newton's personality problems. Nature didn't care if its discoverer was a difficult person. The laws of physics operated with perfect consistency whether Newton was having a good day or plotting to destroy a colleague's career. Newton's later years were marked by increasingly erratic behavior and growing obsession with non-scientific pursuits. As master of the Royal Mint, he pursued counterfeiters with the same relentless intensity he'd once applied to physics. He developed elaborate theories about biblical chronology, attempting to use astronomical calculations to date events in ancient history. He continued his alchemical investigations, convinced that he was on the verge of discovering the philosopher's stone. These pursuits seem bizarre from a modern perspective, but they reflected Newton's consistent belief that the universe was governed by hidden patterns that human intelligence could discover. If mathematical laws controlled planetary motion, perhaps similar principles governed historical events, chemical transformations, and spiritual phenomena. Newton's biblical chronology was based on sophisticated astronomical calculations. He used ancient records of eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and other celestial events to establish precise dates for biblical events. His chronology disagreed with accepted dates by several centuries, but it was based on rigorous mathematical analysis of available evidence. His alchemical work was equally systematic. Newton performed thousands of experiments, documented detailed procedures, and developed elaborate theories about the transmutation of metals. He believed that understanding alchemical processes would reveal fundamental truths about the nature of matter and force. From a modern perspective, these investigations seem like a waste of Newton's extraordinary talents. But Newton saw them as natural extensions of his physical investigations. If the universe was mathematically ordered, that order should be discoverable in all aspects of natural and human experience. By the time Newton died in 1727, his gravitational theory had become the foundation of all physical science. Students learned Newtonian mechanics the way they learned arithmetic, as fundamental tools for understanding reality. The Royal Society commissioned a tomb that described Newton as someone who surpassed the human species in the power of thought. Newton's funeral was a state occasion attended by nobility, scientists, and government officials. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, among kings and national heroes. Alexander Pope wrote his famous epitaph, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said let Newton be, and all was light." But Newton's real legacy wasn't just his specific discoveries. He'd established a new way of understanding the universe, not through revelation, tradition, or philosophical argument, but through mathematical analysis of carefully observed phenomena. He'd shown that reality had an underlying logical structure that human minds could discover and understand. This was perhaps humanity's most important intellectual achievement. Before Newton, we lived in a mysterious universe where natural phenomena seemed arbitrary and unpredictable. Storms, diseases, and disasters struck without warning or apparent cause. The movements of celestial objects followed patterns that could be observed but not explained. After Newton, we inhabited a comprehensible cosmos governed by discoverable laws. The difference wasn't just academic, it was the foundation for all modern science and technology. Every satellite launched, every bridge built, every spacecraft trajectory calculated depends on principles that Newton first articulated in his Woolsthorpe orchard. The transition from medieval to modern worldview was gradual and complex, involving many thinkers over several centuries. But Newton's gravitational theory marked a decisive turning point. After the Principia, it became impossible to view the universe as fundamentally mysterious or arbitrary. Nature operated according to mathematical principles that human intelligence could discover and exploit. This intellectual revolution had practical consequences that extended far beyond physics. If natural phenomena followed mathematical laws, then human societies might also operate according to discoverable principles. Economists began searching for mathematical laws governing markets and trade. Political theorists looked for scientific principles of government and social organization. The Enlightenment faith in reason and progress was built on Newtonian foundations. If Newton could discover the mathematical laws governing planetary motion, perhaps other thinkers could discover equally fundamental principles governing human behavior, social organization, and moral reasoning. Adam Smith's economic theories were explicitly modeled on Newtonian mechanics. Smith sought to identify the natural laws of economic behavior that would produce optimal outcomes through the operation of individual self-interest. His invisible hand was essentially a social version of Newton's gravitational force, an unseen principle that coordinated complex interactions and produced stable, predictable results. Political theorists like Montesquieu analyzed government systems using mechanical metaphors derived from Newton's physics. They sought to identify the forces that held political systems together and the principles that determined stability or instability in different forms of government. Even moral philosophy was influenced by Newton's example. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham attempted to develop mathematical approaches to ethics, seeking to quantify happiness and calculate the optimal distribution of benefits and harms. If physical phenomena could be reduced to mathematical relationships, perhaps moral phenomena could be similarly quantified and optimized. This scientification of human knowledge had mixed results. Economics, political science, and moral philosophy all benefited from more rigorous analytical methods. But the complexity of human behavior resisted the kind of precise mathematical description that worked so well for planetary motion. Einstein would later modify Newton's gravitational theory, showing that space and time were more flexible than Newton had imagined. But even Einstein's relativity was built on Newton's foundation. the assumption that the universe operates according to mathematical principles that human intelligence can discover and understand. Einstein's modifications were profound but limited in scope. For most practical purposes, designing bridges, launching satellites, calculating trajectories, Newton's laws remain perfectly adequate. The corrections introduced by relativity become significant only at very high speeds, in very strong gravitational fields, or over very large distances. The relationship between Newton's and Einstein's theories illustrates an important feature of scientific progress. New theories don't usually prove old theories completely wrong. Instead, they reveal the limited scope of earlier theories and provide more general frameworks that include the older theories as special cases. Newton's laws remain valid within their domain of applicability. Engineers still use fBitMa to design machinery. Astronomers still use Newton's law of gravitation to calculate spacecraft trajectories. The mathematical tools Newton developed continue to be essential for most practical applications. Einstein's general relativity revealed that Newton's absolute space and time were approximations that worked well under normal conditions, but broke down in extreme circumstances. Space and time were actually aspects of a single, flexible spacetime that could be warped by mass and energy. Gravity wasn't a force, but a geometric property of curved spacetime. These insights were revolutionary, but they didn't invalidate Newton's achievement. Newton had discovered the mathematical structure underlying most natural phenomena. Einstein showed that this structure was embedded in a more complex geometric framework, but the basic Newtonian relationships remained valid in most situations. Standing in his mother's orchard in 1666, watching apples fall while contemplating the moon's orbit, Newton couldn't have imagined the full consequences of his gravitational insight. He was just a young man trying to understand why things fell down instead of up, armed with nothing but curiosity, mathematical genius, and an almost pathological inability to leave interesting problems unsolved. That combination, curiosity, mathematical skill, and obsessive persistence, had revealed the hidden machinery of the cosmos. Newton's gravity wasn't just a force, it was the first glimpse into the mathematical structure of reality itself. Everything else, the Industrial Revolution, space travel, modern physics, our entire technological civilization, followed from that moment of insight when a brilliant, difficult young man realized that the same force pulling fruit from trees was holding the solar system together. The apple fell. Newton thought about it harder and longer than any reasonable person should, and the universe became comprehensible. Sometimes the most profound discoveries start with the simplest observations, and sometimes it takes a mind like Newton's to realize that simple observations aren't simple at all, but windows into the fundamental architecture of existence. Newton's gravitational insight transformed humanity's relationship with the natural world. Before Newton, people lived in a universe that seemed capricious and unpredictable. Natural disasters, diseases, and celestial phenomena appeared to follow no discernible pattern. The gods of fate or divine providence determined when storms would strike, when crops would fail, when plagues would devastate populations. After Newton, the universe revealed itself as lawful and predictable. Not everything could be calculated. The mathematics was often too complex, the initial conditions too uncertain, the relevant variables too numerous. But in principle, natural phenomena followed discoverable rules that could be understood and exploited. This transformation in worldview was gradual and uneven. Many people continued to interpret natural events in traditional religious or supernatural terms. But among educated elites, particularly in Western Europe, Newton's mechanical universe became the dominant paradigm for understanding natural phenomena. The psychological impact of this transformation can hardly be overstated. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where natural events seemed arbitrary and mysterious. Lightning might be divine punishment, disease might be supernatural affliction, astronomical events might portend political disasters. The boundary between natural and supernatural was fluid and uncertain. Newtonian mechanics suggested that this boundary was absolute and impermeable. Natural phenomena operated according to mathematical laws that left no room for supernatural intervention. Miracles became problematic, prophecy seemed impossible, and magical thinking appeared primitive and superstitious. This new worldview was simultaneously empowering and alienating. Human beings gained unprecedented power to understand and control natural phenomena. But they also found themselves living in a cosmos that seemed mechanically indifferent to human values, hopes, and concerns. The emotional consequences of living in a Newtonian universe were complex and contradictory. Scientific knowledge provided the foundation for technological progress that dramatically improved living conditions. Medicine, agriculture, transportation, and manufacturing all benefited from the mathematical analysis of natural phenomena. But the mechanical universe also seemed to diminish human significance. If people were merely complex arrangements of particles following mathematical laws, what happened to human dignity, moral responsibility, and spiritual meaning? The cosmos revealed by Newton was magnificent in its mathematical elegance, but it seemed cold and inhuman. Romantic poets and philosophers reacted against the mechanization of nature by emphasizing emotion, imagination, and spiritual experience. William Blake famously criticized Newton for reducing the rainbow to geometric optics, arguing that scientific analysis destroyed the wonder and mystery that made life meaningful. This tension between scientific and humanistic worldviews would persist throughout the modern period. Science provided unprecedented power to understand and manipulate natural phenomena, but it seemed to drain meaning and purpose from human existence. The universe revealed by physics was mathematically beautiful but emotionally sterile. Newton himself seemed largely unaware of these broader cultural implications. He was focused on technical problems, refining his calculations, developing new mathematical techniques, and pursuing investigations in optics, alchemy, and biblical chronology. The broader significance of his work for human self-understanding apparently didn't concern him. This narrow focus was both Newton's strength and his limitation. His single-minded obsession with mathematical precision enabled him to develop theories of extraordinary power and elegance, but it also made him oblivious to the human implications of his discoveries. Newton's personal life reflected this same narrow focus. He never married, had few close friends, and seemed genuinely puzzled by normal human emotions and motivations. His social interactions were often awkward and sometimes hostile. He was more comfortable with mathematical equations and with human relationships. Yet this emotional detachment may have been necessary for his scientific achievements. Newton's willingness to abandon anthropocentric assumptions, his ability to imagine that human-scale intuitions might be irrelevant to understanding natural phenomena, was crucial to his success. Most people assumed that the rules governing earthly phenomena must be fundamentally different from those governing celestial objects. It seemed obvious that earthly things were imperfect, temporary, and changeable, while heavenly bodies were perfect, eternal, and immutable. Newton's genius lay partly in his willingness to question this obvious assumption. Maybe the same mathematical laws applied everywhere. Maybe the distinction between earthly and celestial phenomena was artificial and misleading. Maybe the universe was unified by principles that transcended human categories and expectations. This intellectual courage, the willingness to abandon comfortable assumptions and follow mathematical logic, wherever it led, was Newton's most important contribution. He showed that human intuition was often wrong about fundamental matters, but that mathematical analysis could reveal truths that transcended common sense. The method Newton pioneered, careful observation combined with mathematical analysis, became the foundation for all subsequent scientific investigation. Scientists learned to distrust intuition and common sense, to rely instead on measurement, calculation, and logical analysis. This methodological revolution was perhaps more important than any of Newton's specific discoveries. Individual theories could be modified or replaced as new evidence became available. But the basic approach Newton established, the insistence that natural phenomena must be analyzed mathematically rather than explained through storytelling or philosophical speculation, became permanently embedded in scientific culture. Newton's influence extended far beyond physics and mathematics. His success convinced subsequent generations of thinkers that rigorous analysis could reveal hidden truths in any domain of knowledge. Economists, psychologists, sociologists, and political scientists all attempted to apply Newton's mathematical methods to human behavior and social phenomena. These attempts had mixed success. Human behavior proved more complex and less predictable than planetary motion. Mathematical models of social phenomena were often crude approximations that ignored crucial variables and oversimplified complex relationships. But the Newtonian faith in the power of mathematical analysis to reveal hidden truths remained influential. Even when specific applications failed, the underlying assumption persisted: reality had a mathematical structure that patient investigation could discover and exploit. This assumption has been vindicated repeatedly in the natural sciences. Physics, chemistry, biology, and astronomy have all revealed mathematical patterns that enable prediction and control of natural phenomena. The universe has turned out to be even more mathematical than Newton imagined. Modern physics describes reality in terms of abstract mathematical structures, quantum fields, curved spacetime, multidimensional symmetries that bear little resemblance to everyday experience. But these mathematical abstractions enable incredibly precise predictions about natural phenomena. Particle accelerators, GPS satellites, nuclear reactors, and computer chips all depend on mathematical theories that would have been incomprehensible to Newton. Yet they all exemplify the basic Newtonian insight that natural phenomena follow mathematical laws that human intelligence can discover and exploit. The trajectory from Newton's falling apple to modern quantum field theory illustrates the cumulative power of mathematical analysis. Each generation of scientists has built on the work of their predecessors, developing more sophisticated mathematical tools and discovering deeper layers of natural law. This cumulative progress has been possible only because Newton established the fundamental methodological principle. Natural phenomena must be analyzed mathematically rather than explained through story, telling, or philosophical speculation. Individual theories may be wrong, but mathematical analysis reliably reveals aspects of natural structure that remain hidden from casual observation. Newton's gravitational theory has been modified by relativity and quantum mechanics, but the basic mathematical relationship he discovered, that gravitational force depends on mass and distance, remains accurate for most practical purposes. The corrections introduced by more advanced theories become significant only in extreme conditions that Newton never encountered. This robustness of Newton's laws within their domain of applicability illustrates another important feature of scientific progress. Scientific theories aren't simply right or wrong. They're approximations that work well under specified conditions and break down when those conditions are violated. Newton's mechanics works perfectly for objects moving much slower than light in gravitational fields much weaker than those near black holes. These conditions include virtually all everyday phenomena and most astronomical situations. Within these limits, Newton's laws remain as valid today as they were in the 17th century. The limitations of Newton's theories only became apparent when 20th century technology enabled scientists to observe phenomena in extreme conditions. High-speed particles, strong gravitational fields, and atomic scale interactions revealed deviations from Newtonian predictions that required more sophisticated theories to explain. But these limitations don't invalidate Newton's achievement. He discovered mathematical laws that accurately describe natural phenomena within an enormously broad domain. The fact that these laws require modification in extreme conditions doesn't diminish their importance for understanding normal experience. Newton's success established the template for all subsequent scientific investigation, careful observation, mathematical analysis, and rigorous testing of theoretical predictions. This methodology has proven extraordinarily powerful for understanding natural phenomena and developing useful technologies. The civilization we inhabit today, with its satellites, computers, medicines, and transportation systems, is built on mathematical understanding of natural phenomena that began with Newton's insight in his mother's orchard. The falling apple didn't just inspire a theory of gravity, it initiated the process of scientific investigation that has transformed human existence. Standing in that orchard in 1666, Newton couldn't have imagined smartphones, space stations, or GPS navigation. But his insight that natural phenomena follow mathematical laws made all these technologies possible. The same intellectual courage that enabled Newton to question why apples fall also enabled subsequent generations to discover electromagnetic fields, atomic structure, and quantum mechanics. Newton's legacy isn't just his specific discoveries, important as they were. His most profound contribution was demonstrating that human reason, armed with mathematics, could penetrate the apparent mysteries of natural phenomena and reveal underlying laws that enable prediction and control. This demonstration transformed human self-understanding. Before Newton, people lived in a world that seemed fundamentally mysterious and unpredictable. Natural events appeared to reflect divine will, supernatural forces, or inexplicable fate. After Newton, educated people began to inhabit a lawful universe where natural phenomena followed discoverable rules. This transformation in worldview was gradual and incomplete, but it fundamentally changed how humans related to their natural environment. Instead of propitiating supernatural forces or accepting natural disasters as inevitable, people began to think they could understand and potentially control natural phenomena. This shift in attitude was prerequisite for the technological developments that have shaped modern civilization. Newton's insight that the same mathematical laws apply to earthly and celestial phenomena had implications that extended far beyond physics. If natural phenomena were unified by mathematical principles, perhaps human societies were also governed by discoverable laws. This possibility inspired centuries of investigation into the mathematical structure of economic, political, and social phenomena. While these investigations have had mixed success, they reflect the continuing influence of Newton's fundamental insight. Reality has a mathematical structure that human intelligence can discover and exploit. The questions Newton raised about the nature of gravity, how objects separated by empty space can influence each other, remained unanswered for centuries. Einstein's general relativity provided a partial answer by showing that gravity results from the curvature of spacetime, but deeper questions about the nature of space, time, and matter remain unresolved. Modern physics continues to grapple with problems that have their roots in Newton's work. The search for a unified theory that would reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity reflects the same desire for mathematical unification that motivated Newton's investigation of universal gravitation. Whether such unification is possible remains uncertain, but the search itself reflects the continuing influence of Newton's methodological approach. The conviction that natural phenomena, however complex or mysterious they may appear, ultimately follow mathematical laws that human intelligence can discover and understand. Newton's falling apple has become one of the most famous anecdotes in the history of science, a symbol of the moment when human reason penetrated the mysteries of natural phenomena and revealed the mathematical structure underlying appearances. Whether the story is literally true matters less than its symbolic significance. Newton's insight that the same force governing falling objects also controls planetary motion represents the kind of intellectual breakthrough that transforms human understanding of reality. The apple's fall was significant not because it was unusual, but because Newton recognized its universal implications. Every day, countless objects fall to Earth. Only Newton realized that this commonplace phenomenon revealed fundamental truths about the structure of the universe. This ability to see universal principles in particular phenomena is perhaps the defining characteristic of scientific genius. Newton looked at falling apples and saw gravitational force. Darwin looked at finches and saw evolutionary adaptation. Einstein looked at the constant speed of light and saw the relativity of space and time. In each case, the breakthrough involved recognizing that familiar phenomena had implications that transcended common sense and conventional wisdom. Scientific progress requires the intellectual courage to question obvious assumptions and the mathematical skill to develop alternative theories. Newton possessed both qualities in extraordinary measure. His willingness to question why objects fall led him to discover universal gravitation. His mathematical abilities enabled him to develop precise theories that could be tested against observation. This combination of intellectual courage and mathematical skill transformed human understanding of natural phenomena and established the methodological foundation for all subsequent scientific investigation. And that's how Sir Isaac Newton discovered gravity, not through divine inspiration or accidental revelation, but through the stubborn application of mathematical reasoning to phenomena that everyone else took for granted. He looked at falling objects and saw universal principles. He looked at the moon and saw celestial mechanics. He looked at a universe that seemed mysterious and arbitrary, and found it was actually elegant, predictable, and governed by laws that human minds could understand and use. In the end, Newton's greatest discovery wasn't gravity itself, but the realization that discovery was possible, that the universe kept its secrets in mathematical form, waiting for minds clever and persistent enough to decode them. The apple that fell in Woolsthorpe didn't just hit the ground, it opened the door to the modern scientific understanding of reality. And Newton, difficult, brilliant, obsessive Newton, walked through that door and showed the rest of humanity what lay on the other side, a cosmos that made sense, governed by laws that could be discovered, understood, and used to reshape the world. Not bad for a 22-year-old stuck at home during a pandemic, pondering why things fall down instead of up. Sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the simplest questions, asked by someone too curious and too stubborn to accept "that's just how things are" as a satisfactory answer. Newton's falling apple didn't just inspire a theory, it launched the scientific revolution that continues to transform human existence today.